In this lesson, we are starting looking at the graphs of our radical functions more, but now looking at the characteristics of them. So in this lesson, we're just focusing on the domain and range, and then looking at intervals or parts of our graph to see if the values, the y values, are positive or negative. So again, here, remember, right? So our domain is always the x values, and the range is always the y values. So like here's our graph here. Notice our radical function plus 5. So notice how it got moved up 5. What we're going to do though is with our graph here, like our half graph or our radical, notice how it starts here and then just continues on to infinity in one direction. So to identify the domain and range, we need to identify the starting point. So the starting point right now is here at 0, 5. So notice how this is our starting x value, this is our starting y value. That is the starting values for the domain and range. So again, right, the domain is the x values, which are starting at 0. The range is the y values, which is starting here at 5. Now things are going to get a little tricky here because now we have to see if the values are greater than or less than. We'll notice x, so this is your x-axis, right? So we're looking at the direction in terms of the left and right. We'll notice from our starting point, the graph is going to the right, towards all the positive, right? So going on and on and on. So all of our x values that this graph is covering is greater than or equal to 0. So then our range here, now notice what do we have to do from here? Well, the graph is going up. So again, all the y values are greater than or equal to 5. So they're both greater than or equal to values. Now we could also write this as 0 to infinity because we're going greater, and 5 to infinity because again, we're going greater. Then looking at the interval, this section, to see if the values are positive or negative. So we are looking at x values of 5 to 8. So from 5 to 8. So we're going to go up to look at this section of the graph here from 5 to 8. Notice how it's up above in the positive. So these values are positive because again, it's up above. So let's take a look here and let's do our next example. Now notice how this one is reflected over the x-axis and it got moved 5 to the left. So here, again, domain and range. So we need to identify our starting point and then our graph continuing on in this one direction. So our graph is starting at -5, 0. So here again, this is my x, this is my y. So my domain is my x values, which are starting at -5, and my range is my y values starting at 0. So now let's look at the direction. So from here, what direction is our graph going? To the right. So again, towards greater, we're going to the right. So greater than or equal to, or -5 to infinity. Now, and I realized we're going to need parentheses because you can't include infinity. So there we go. Now our range though is different because now from here, what direction are we going? Up or down? We're going down. So now notice our y values are not greater than 0, they are all below, less than or equal to 0. So this is our range for our graph here, which means because it's less than, now we're starting at -infinity and up to 0. Now looking at our interval from 2 to 4. So looking at the x values from 2 to 4. So we're looking at this section of the graph here. Notice where is this section of the graph? Below in the negative. So those values are negative over that interval. we're going to do a couple more examples here before you try some you try. So again, identify the starting point. We're going in this direction. So our starting point now is at -4, 2. So -4, 2. So here's my x, here's my y. So again, my domain is starting at -4. My range, my y values are starting at 2. So now from the starting point, what direction are we going? Left or right? The graph is going to the left now, towards all the negative, less than. So this is less than or equal to -4. Or again, we're going into the negative infinity and stopping at -4. So then here, now what direction are we going? From here, the graph is going up. So the graph is going up, which is now greater than or equal to 2. So again, greater than or equal to. So again, we're starting at 2 and going to positive infinity. Now let's look at our section of the graph here. Our x values, this interval from -5 to -10. So we're looking at this section of the graph, which is -5 to -10. So notice, where's our graph? Above or below? Above, in the positive. So the values of the graph over that interval are positive. Let's do this last example here. Again, identifying our starting point, our graph going on in this one direction. So we're at -1, 5. So -1, 5. Here's our x, here's our y. So what value is our domain starting at? -1. Where's our range? Our y value starting at? 5. So now let's look at the direction. So here we go. From our starting point, we're going to the left, which means we're going less than or equal to -1. So we write this as negative infinity to -1 here. Then our range from here, is our graph going up or down? Down. So this is also y values are less than or equal to 5, or again, negative infinity to 5 with our bracket. Now looking at our interval, so those x values from -2 to -5. So that means we are looking at this section of the graph. So notice how here that section is above in the positive. So those values are positive. So go ahead and pause the video now and do these two U tries on your own. And here we go. So let's see how you did. So we're going to identify our starting point, which is at 2, 1, which means your x values are starting at 2, that's your x coordinate. Y values are starting at 1, that's your y coordinate. Then going on in this one direction, so you should have noticed that the graph is going to the right, which shows greater than or equal to. So that means you also write this as starting at 2, including 2, so we need the bracket, going on to infinity with our parenthesis. Then from here, the graph is going up, so you should have recognized also greater than or equal to. So again, including brackets starting at 1 and going to infinity. So our parentheses here, not including. Then our interval of 3 to 7. So you're looking at this section of the graph here. Those values are up above, which are positive. So now here, you had to identify starting point is now at 1, -2. That means your domain x values are starting at 1, and your range, your y values are starting at -2, going on in this direction. So from here, the graph was going to the left, which means now less than or equal to. So not including, right, parentheses, negative infinity, and stopping at 1, including that 1 here. Then the graph from there is going up. So that means the y values are greater than. So we are starting at -2 and then going on to infinity, not including, so keep your parentheses. So now with the interval, we're going to look at -5 to -7, this section of the graph here, which is also above, those values are positive. So last example in U try. This is looking at now the Q-drew function. So notice this is the graph of our Q-drew. Notice how it's going on and on in both directions. So our domain and range, so the domain, is there a starting or stopping point? No, because it's going on and on in both directions. So our domain is all real numbers, or -infinity to +infinity. Then our range is, again, there a starting point? No, the graph is constantly going up and down. So again, the range is also -infinity to infinity. So with our Q-drew function, because there is no starting stopping point, going on and on and on in both directions, right? Left and right, up and down. So the domain and range is all reals. Then looking at our values from 5 to 8 here. So looking at this section of the graph, notice how this is above in the positive. So those values are positive. So go ahead and pause the video and try this U try on your own. And here we go. So again, a Q-drew function, right? So again, what does that automatically mean about the domain and range? All real numbers. So again, -infinity to infinity. Then looking at your interval here from 5 to 8. So x values 5 to 8. We're looking at this section of the graph. Now notice this section is below in the negative. So those y values of the function are negative.